It was January 1944. The Pacific was a graveyard of ambition, a sky of shifting allegiances and fading empires. Japan still believed it ruled the air, that its Zero fighters, agile and revered, could outmaneuver anything the Allies built. But beyond the horizon, something new was coming. Slick, silver, relentless. The P-51 Mustang. At first, Japanese intelligence called it overrated. Reports trickled in through their spy networks, clumsy sketches, misheard engine specifications, fragments of intercepted radio chatter. The verdict was confident, almost dismissive. This new American plane is fast but fragile. Limited range. No real threat. They were wrong. Fatally wrong. What happens when a nation's confidence rests on bad intelligence? When one careless spy, one mistranslated report, convinces an empire to underestimate its enemy. The story of how Japanese spies misjudged the power of the P-51 Mustang is not just about a plane, it is about the quiet arrogance that leads to ruin. In war, truth is more dangerous than any weapon. And in the winter of 1944, truth came roaring across the Pacific in the form of a Mustang engine. Imagine the scene, an overcast morning on Iwo Jima. A Japanese officer receives an intelligence brief sealed with red wax. Inside, data that would shape aerial strategy for months to come. Numbers, diagrams, confidence. But behind those numbers lay human error, and perhaps something worse, wishful thinking. The spies assigned to monitor American aircraft movements had been operating with limited access and outdated tools. Many had never even seen a P-51 up close. Their estimates came from second-hand witnesses, ground observers, and distorted aerial photos. They concluded the Mustang could fly no farther than 400 miles from base, a range too short to threaten Japan's mainland. Yet, as American engineers fitted the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and drop tanks, its range tripled. Suddenly, Tokyo was within reach. But Japan didn't know. Its leaders believed their skies were safe. That misjudgment, that fatal comfort, would soon turn every sunrise into an omen. The intelligence failure began as a whisper and ended as a roar. The P-51, dismissed as a lightweight escort fighter, became the shadow that followed every Japanese bomber, the silver blade that cut through formations once thought invincible. By the time Tokyo realized what it faced, the damage was irreversible. History would later call it a miscalculation. But for the pilots who faced the Mustang, it felt like betrayal. They had been trained to fight machines of a different age, slower, heavier, predictable. The Mustang changed the rules overnight. It was faster at altitude, steadier in dives, and could fly deep into Japanese territory, escorting bombers that once had to turn back. The spy reports had promised something else entirely, a target they could outfly. Instead, they met a ghost they could never catch. This film tells that story, the unseen chain of mistakes, the paper trails of arrogance, the quiet overconfidence that sealed Japan's defeat. It is not only a chronicle of aircraft and battles but a portrait of human blindness, of how pride, bureaucracy, and false certainty can destroy even the most disciplined empire. And if you think a single wrong report cannot change the course of history, think again. What if the spy had been right? What if Tokyo had known the true power of the Mustang before it was too late? Would the war have ended differently? Or was the outcome already written, in the ambition of men who refused to see beyond their own doctrines? Before we dive into this forgotten story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Here, every week, we uncover the secrets history tried to bury, the small decisions that shaped empires, and the mistakes that brought them down. Join us and witness how truth, once ignored, always returns, louder than any engine. Because the story of the P-51 Mustang is not just about technology. It's about the cost of arrogance. As the winter skies of 1944 turned pale with contrails, Japanese pilots rose to meet what they thought was another American fighter. They didn't know they were staring into the future, a future their own spies had failed to see. In the years before 1944, Japan's intelligence network stretched thin across Asia and the Pacific, from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands, from Formosa to the Philippines. It was a web designed for conquest, not caution. Its purpose was to confirm what leaders already believed, not to challenge it. Inside Tokyo's military headquarters, the atmosphere was one of confidence, a confidence built on memory. The early years of the war had seen the Zero dominate the skies. Its pilots, swift and daring, shredded the first waves of Allied aircraft. Every officer in the Imperial Navy remembered those victories as proof of divine skill and national superiority. That pride was intoxicating and dangerous. When the first mentions of a new American fighter reached Japan, no one felt alarm. Reports were analyzed, debated, filed away. Some described the plane as a high-speed pursuit craft. Others claimed it lacked maneuverability, or that its engine was prone to overheating in tropical climates. Each new report seemed to confirm what Tokyo wanted to hear, that the Americans had built a plane too complex, too fragile, too foreign to last. But the truth was already out there, written in the sky above Europe. The Mustang had proven itself long before it reached the Pacific. It had escorted bombers deep into Germany, crossed distances no other single-engine fighter could, and returned home with minimal loss. In England, pilots called it the perfect balance of power and grace. In Tokyo they called it a rumor. How could such blindness persist? The answer lies in culture as much as strategy. The Imperial Japanese military valued obedience over curiosity. A report that contradicted established belief was not treated as insight, it was treated as insubordination. Analysts learned quickly what not to say. A spy could risk his reputation, even his life, by sending unwelcome truths up the chain of command. And so, when an intelligence officer in the Pacific filed his analysis of the new fighter, his words were trimmed, edited, softened. What began as uncertainty became assumption. The Mustang's actual performance data, its top speed of over 430 miles per hour, its altitude advantage, its extended range, was lost in translation and arrogance alike. There is a cruel irony in this. Japan's intelligence community was filled with brilliant minds, linguists, engineers, mathematicians, yet the system that employed them refused to listen. It prized harmony over accuracy. Reports were polished to fit the narrative of an invincible empire. In early 1944, a coded message reached Tokyo from an informant in the Marianas. It described a strange American fighter appearing at high altitude, faster than a thunderbolt, smaller than a lightning. The report included engine details that, if taken seriously, could have revealed the presence of the Merlin-powered Mustang. But the analyst assigned to review it dismissed the claim. He marked it as technically improbable. The note was filed under inconclusive. That same week, American Mustangs were already escorting bombers hundreds of miles beyond what Japanese command believed possible. The gap between belief and reality widened every day. Japanese radar operators, hearing new engine sounds in the sky, sent confused reports. Some thought they were experimental bombers. Others believed they were modified Lightnings. Pilots who survived encounters came back shaken, describing a machine that climbed faster, turned harder, and refused to fall. They spoke of frustration, of disbelief. Their commanders accused them of exaggeration. In every war, there is a moment when information ceases to be a tool and becomes an illusion. For Japan, that moment had come. As the Mustang cut through Pacific airspace, its silver body glinting in sunlight, it became both a weapon and a warning. It signaled not only American technological superiority but also the collapse of Japanese perception. The empire that had prided itself on foresight could no longer see. Somewhere within the dense bureaucratic maze of Tokyo's military intelligence offices, one man, an analyst named Lieutenant Nakahara, began to sense the pattern. He re-examined the field reports, recalculated the range, and noticed the error in the original data. The spies had confused internal fuel capacity with operational range, ignoring external drop tanks. The Mustang's true radius of action was nearly triple what had been assumed. Nakahara wrote a memo, calm, detailed, urgent. He sent it to his superior. It never reached the high command. The memo was buried under a pile of routine communications. Weeks later, when Nakahara asked for confirmation, his supervisor waved him off. The matter is closed, he was told. The Americans cannot reach us. But they could. By late spring of 1944, the Mustangs appeared over Saipan. Their presence stunned Japanese pilots who thought they were safe at altitude. One by one, the myths of invulnerability began to fall. Dogfights that should have favored Japan turned into ambushes. Intercept squadrons failed to meet bombers in time. And still, Tokyo clung to outdated intelligence, convinced that these raids were limited, temporary, exceptional. Every victory the Mustang won carved deeper cracks into the empire's illusion. Think of it, an entire nation's air defense strategy shaped by a few pieces of bad information. Can a spy's single mistake doom thousands? History's answer is merciless, yes. The pilots paid the price first. Many were veterans of the early Pacific triumphs, men who had once outflown every opponent. They entered battle expecting an equal fight and found instead an enemy that fought on new terms. Their planes, designed for close-turning combat, could not match the Mustang's speed or climb. Even the best aces felt their instincts betray them. What they thought they knew about air warfare no longer applied. As the war dragged on, the Japanese High Command ordered desperate adaptations. Interceptors were modified, tactics rewritten. But no design could erase the time lost to misinformation. The Empire had misjudged not only an aircraft but an era. The Mustang symbolized a new kind of war, one fought by machines that transcended geography. It rendered the Pacific's vast distances irrelevant. Japan's defensive perimeter, once considered impenetrable, shrank overnight. Behind closed doors, some Japanese officers began to whisper the unthinkable, that their intelligence apparatus had failed them. Not because of incompetence but because of pride. A system built on obedience cannot admit error. Still, the truth pressed in from every side. Reports from the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and the Marianas confirmed the same fact. The Mustang was not a myth. It was the messenger of inevitability. In later months, surviving documents revealed another unsettling detail. The spy whose original report downplayed the Mustang's range had never been punished. In fact, he was promoted. The system rewarded the comfort of lies. By mid-1945, as American bombers rained destruction on Japanese cities, the Mustang's shadow fell everywhere. It was not the cause of defeat alone, but it was the symbol of it, the embodiment of every mistake that pride refused to see. And in that shadow, a lesson remains. Wars are not only lost on battlefields. They are lost in offices, in translation rooms, in the silence that follows when someone dares to tell the truth and no one listens. So, when you hear the story of Japan's fall, remember this: it was not just bombs and bullets that ended the empire. It was belief. It was the human need to be right, even when the evidence screamed otherwise. If you've stayed with us this far, take a moment, subscribe and keep watching. Because what comes next is the heart of the story, the moment when the empire finally saw the truth it had denied. The day the sky itself turned against them. By the summer of 1944, the sky over the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. The illusion cracked quietly at first. A single raid that went farther than it should have, a formation that appeared where no enemy could possibly reach. Then it became impossible to ignore. The P-51 Mustang was everywhere. From Saipan to Okinawa, pilots reported encounters that defied logic. American bombers escorted by fighters deep into what had once been untouchable territory. Commanders dismissed early reports as exaggerations, but the pilots knew. They could hear it, the clean, high-pitched whistle of the Mustang's Merlin engine cutting through the clouds, closing distance faster than anything they had faced before. At first, they believed it must be a trick. The Americans, they reasoned, had somehow staged temporary bases closer to Japan. But reconnaissance revealed nothing. No new airfields. No carriers in range. Only one conclusion remained. The enemy's planes could go farther than any Japanese aircraft had ever imagined. Panic began to whisper through the ranks. How could the intelligence reports have been so wrong? How could a fighter they had written off as limited in range now appear above Tokyo's horizon? The truth was brutal. Every assumption Japan had built its aerial defense upon was collapsing. In underground briefings, officers reviewed engagement logs, their faces pale under the light. Time and again, Japanese pilots reported being chased at altitudes that should have been impossible. When the Mustang dived, its speed tore through the air with surgical precision. The Japanese Zero, though graceful, was built for a different era. Its lightweight frame could not dive fast enough without tearing apart. Dogfights that once relied on the art of close maneuvering turned suicidal. The Mustang refused to play by those rules. It attacked from distance, struck once, and vanished into the sun. The old way of fighting, the way Japan had perfected, was obsolete. Still, the High Command refused to admit the scale of the failure. Memos circulated urging pilots to retain faith in the Zero's superiority. Analysts were told to find weaknesses in the new American design. Reports became more desperate. Some suggested that the Mustang's high performance was a fluke, that its engine could not handle tropical humidity, that it was vulnerable in low-altitude turns. None of it was true. Inside the cockpit, the story was different. Japanese pilots described a sense of helplessness. They fought bravely, often suicidally, but they were fighting against physics itself. The Mustang's combination of range, power, and endurance rewrote the sky. The air war had moved into a new dimension, and Japan's intelligence community had never seen it coming. Every victory the Americans claimed, every successful escort mission, carried a shadow of irony. The very reason those missions succeeded was because Japan's spies had failed to warn their leaders in time. There is a silence in history, the silence of those who realized too late. Some Japanese officers in private began to acknowledge the truth. They had underestimated the enemy and overestimated themselves. The arrogance that had once fueled their empire was now its poison. Imagine being one of those pilots flying into combat with an aircraft you were told could win, only to discover that the enemy knew everything you didn't. The Mustang could climb higher, sustain longer flights, and strike deeper. Every engagement became a test of endurance that Japan could not pass. By the fall of 1944, the war in the Pacific was transforming. The Allies no longer needed to fight for every island. The Mustang's long reach allowed bombers to bypass strongholds, striking directly at supply lines and factories. Japanese production collapsed under the weight of sustained raids. Each new strike proved what the spies had failed to see, that the American war machine had evolved beyond reach. The empire's airfields, once symbols of control, became targets. On the ground, mechanics watched helplessly as squadrons were destroyed before they could even take off. The Mustang did not simply win battles, it erased possibilities. There is a cruel clarity in hindsight. Japan's intelligence officers, reviewing captured reports after the war, discovered just how far off their estimates had been. The original analysis placed the Mustang's operational range at less than 800 kilometers. In reality, it exceeded 2,500. That single figure changed everything. And behind that mistake was a man, the spy whose faulty report had been treated as gospel. His name was lost in the archives, erased by shame or silence. But his error lived on in every lost pilot, every burning airfield, every commander forced to face the truth too late. Was he careless? Or was he merely a product of a system that punished accuracy when it was inconvenient? Perhaps he wanted to tell the truth, but knew that truth had no place in the empire's illusion of victory. War is not only fought with weapons. It is fought with information, and sometimes, the deadliest weapon is what a nation refuses to know. By late 1944, American bombers, now escorted by P-51s, began striking Japan's heartland. The sky above Tokyo burned crimson. Pilots who once saw themselves as samurai of the air now fought to survive another day. The code of honor that glorified death over defeat no longer mattered. There was no glory left, only the mechanical precision of an enemy that had mastered science, and the cold indifference of a sky that no longer belonged to them. Still, propaganda continued. Tokyo's radio broadcast spoke of minor setbacks and temporary incursions. Civilians were told that Japan's divine spirit would prevail. But in the air, there was no divine intervention, only the hum of the Mustang's engine, steady, unstoppable, echoing over a city that had begun to crumble. Somewhere in the ruins of intelligence offices, a young analyst opened a drawer filled with outdated reports. Pages marked confidential fluttered in the draft. He read the numbers, the assumptions, the misplaced confidence, and for a moment he understood. The empire had not been defeated by the Americans. It had been defeated by its own blindness. History rarely records such moments. There is no hero in this story, no single act of redemption. Only a series of small human errors that together built the path to defeat. And yet, hidden within this tragedy lies a warning, not only for Japan but for every nation that builds walls of pride around its truth. Power blinds. Belief blinds deeper. If you're watching this, consider how often history repeats the same pattern. How many times have nations ignored the evidence because it did not fit their expectations? How many leaders have chosen comfort over clarity, loyalty over learning? The sky above the Pacific became a mirror that reflected more than war. It showed the cost of arrogance, the silence that follows when truth tries to speak and no one listens. And so, as 1944 gave way to 1945, the empire that once dreamed of eternal dominance faced the horizon with dread. The Mustang was not just an aircraft. It was a prophecy. A message written in aluminum and fire. The age of illusions was ending. Subscribe and stay with us as we move into the turning point. The moment when Japan's leadership, cornered by their own lies, finally realized what they were facing. The truth could no longer be denied. The defeat had already begun. By early 1945, the war had turned into a nightmare written across the skies. The Japanese homeland, once insulated by distance, was now exposed. The P-51 Mustang had erased geography. What had been miles of safety was now minutes of flight time. Tokyo's horizon, once calm with the morning haze, was filled with silver wings. It was a strange and bitter realization, the moment when the empire's commanders finally understood that the numbers had lied. Not because the enemy had deceived them, but because they had deceived themselves. Inside the Imperial Air Defense Headquarters, silence lingered longer than orders. The latest intelligence brief was read aloud in a voice that trembled at the edges. Enemy fighters now capable of sustained operations over central Honshu. Escort range exceeds previous estimates by significant margin. No one spoke. No one dared to ask how significant. They already knew. The P-51 Mustang had become a machine of inevitability. It could escort B-29 bombers deep into Japan, destroy supply convoys, strike airfields, and still return home with fuel to spare. It was no longer an aircraft. It was a statement. A declaration that Japan's war had entered its final act. And yet, some refused to believe. Pride had become policy. Generals insisted that the Mustang's success was temporary, that divine spirit could still overcome steel. Pilots were ordered to fly into hopeless engagements, to defend an illusion already dead. But illusions burn quickly. In March 1945, the skies over Tokyo glowed orange. Waves of American bombers swept across the city, escorted by Mustangs flying so high and so far that Japanese defenders barely reached them. Those who did often never returned. The once feared Zero, the symbol of Japanese mastery, now looked like a relic against the sleek precision of the Mustang. On the ground, civilians watched the spectacle in silence. The enemy they had been told was weak now flew overhead unchallenged. The hum of the Mustang's engine became the sound of inevitability. It was not just an aircraft, it was the ghost of every lie that had comforted them. Somewhere in the chaos, Lieutenant Nakahara, the analyst whose warnings had been ignored, stood on the roof of a burning building watching. The sky above him was filled with light and sound, the culmination of every error, every dismissed report, every assumption turned to ash. He had once believed his work mattered. Now he understood it had been buried under pride. He wrote in his journal that night, "The sky does not forgive." That sentence would never leave him. For the pilots still fighting, each sortie was a roll of fate. They took off knowing they would not return. The intelligence that had once guided them was worthless. Maps, charts, tactical briefings, all built on falsehoods. In the face of modern engineering, their courage had become meaningless. The Mustang's dominance was total. It fought at altitudes the Japanese could barely reach. It climbed through thin air with a predator's grace, and when it struck, it did so without mercy. The reports from surviving pilots were short, repetitive, hopeless. Enemy approaches from above. Speed unknown. Cannot evade. Lost contact. In truth, they were fighting ghosts, shadows of their own misjudgment. And yet, the human instinct to believe persisted. Some pilots still swore the Americans must be cheating, that no single-engine fighter could perform such miracles. But it was no miracle. It was mathematics, design, precision, everything Japan's intelligence community had underestimated. The empire had always believed that willpower could compensate for weakness, that faith could substitute for analysis. But faith cannot outfly a machine that does not tire, that does not falter, that does not believe. When the Americans captured Iwo Jima, the distance between bases shortened even further. The Mustang's range extended again. The final barrier fell. From that point on, Japan's defeat was a matter of time, measured not in battles but in hours. The airfields once bustling with activity became graveyards. Planes lay wrecked on the tarmac, shredded by strafing runs. Mechanics stood motionless, their faces coated with soot and disbelief. Above them, the Mustang's silver wings glinted in the sun, a sight as beautiful as it was devastating. Tokyo's last defense meetings turned surreal. Officers argued about non-existent weaknesses, desperate for something to hold on to. Some claimed the Mustang was fragile, that one hit could bring it down. Others insisted that divine wind would still intervene. The conversation itself had become delusion. Meanwhile, the Americans no longer spoke of victory as a question. It was a process. Systematic. Efficient. Every strike the Mustangs escorted brought Japan closer to silence. Factories, ports, fuel depots, each burned away another layer of illusion. There was no strategy left to discuss. No hope left to shape. Only the slow, undeniable realization that the empire had been undone by its own blindness. And through it all, the spy, the one whose false report had started it, remained unnamed, his face lost in bureaucratic memory. Perhaps he died before he saw what his error had unleashed. Perhaps he lived long enough to understand it. But his mistake was no longer his alone. It had become a mirror for the entire system that had chosen comfort over truth. In war, a lie can live longer than a man. What must it feel like to realize that everything you believed, everything you fought for, was built on that lie? The answer is written in the eyes of the pilots who survived. Their diaries, recovered after the war, speak of confusion more than fear, the sensation of fighting a war that had already ended, while no one had told them. As the summer of 1945 approached, the Mustang continued to patrol the skies over a nation already broken. Japan's defeat was inevitable, but it was not sudden. It unfolded like a slow, precise operation, each strike cutting deeper into the illusion of control. The empire had reached the point of no return, and still, it tried to believe. Belief is the last weapon of the defeated. In August, when the atomic bomb fell and the war came to its abrupt, merciless end, the Mustang flew overhead, silent witness to the moment the empire ceased to exist. It had not dropped the bomb. It had not issued the surrender. But in many ways, it had prepared the sky for both. Japan's surrender was the final echo of an intelligence failure that began with one useless spy. A man who misread the numbers, who passed on the wrong data, who told his superiors what they wanted to hear. From that moment, defeat had already begun. And so, when the war ended, history closed the file. The reports were burned. The names forgotten. But the consequence remained, written not in paper, but in the memory of a nation. How many wars have been lost not by lack of courage, but by lack of honesty? How many empires have fallen not because their enemies were stronger, but because their leaders refused to listen? That is the question this story leaves behind. And perhaps as you listen now, you can sense the echo of that question in our own world, where truth still competes with pride, and information is still the most dangerous weapon of all. If you've found meaning in this story, if you want to uncover more of the forgotten truths that shaped our history, subscribe. Because this is not the end, it is only one of the many lessons time keeps trying to teach us. The useless Japanese spies did not just misjudge a plane. They misjudged the future. And the future always collects its debt. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. For years, Japan had lived by the hum of engines, by the thunder of distant artillery, by the illusion of control. Now there was only quiet. A quiet so vast it felt like an accusation. The empire that once believed itself invincible was reduced to ashes. Cities lay flattened, airfields abandoned, hangars filled with the twisted remains of aircraft that had never stood a chance. And somewhere beneath that ruin, in the corridors of what used to be the Imperial General Staff, the truth waited, silent, undeniable, unforgiving. The intelligence archives were the first to be destroyed. Officers burned them hastily, shoving reports into barrels of fire. Pages filled with confident lies turned to ash in seconds. The men who had written them stood motionless, watching the smoke curl upward. They said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Among the papers that survived, historians later found fragments, coded transmissions, range estimates, tactical notes. Each one was a small window into the empire's blindness. They revealed not a lack of effort but a lack of honesty. Every report was shaped to fit a comforting narrative, to tell superiors what they wanted to believe. The truth had been visible all along, but it was buried under obedience. For the surviving pilots, the aftermath was worse than defeat. It was reflection. They had fought with honor, believing in skill and sacrifice. Yet skill and sacrifice had meant nothing against a machine their own intelligence had failed to understand. Many returned home to find their cities gone, their families missing, their purpose erased. The few who spoke of the P-51 Mustang did so with quiet awe. It was not a plane, one veteran wrote. It was the end of an era. He wasn't wrong. The Mustang was more than a weapon. It was the symbol of a new kind of warfare, one that depended not only on courage but on science, information, and truth. It was the embodiment of progress, the very thing Japan's war machine had refused to accept. In the post-war years, as Japan rebuilt itself from ruin, engineers and historians began to revisit the mistakes of the past. They studied the intelligence failures, the misjudged reports, the arrogance that blinded the empire. The lessons became the foundation for a new philosophy, one that valued accuracy over loyalty, fact over faith. The same nation that once dismissed innovation would, within decades, become a symbol of technological rebirth. But history never forgets its irony. The Mustang, the aircraft once underestimated, would later be admired in Japanese aviation museums, polished, revered, even loved. Visitors would stand before it in silence, reading the plaques that described its role in the war, unaware that the very plane before them had once carried the shadow of their nation's downfall. The story of the useless spies, those who misjudged the power of the P-51, is not just a story about war. It's a story about human nature. About how belief can warp truth, how pride can blind reason, how even the smallest lie can grow into catastrophe. In the cold light of hindsight, the empire's defeat seems inevitable. But inevitability is built from choices, small, deliberate human choices. A spy deciding not to double-check his numbers. An officer choosing to suppress a report. A commander refusing to question his doctrine. History is not written by destiny. It is written by habits. And the habit that doomed Japan was not weakness. It was certainty. For the Americans, victory came with its own burden. The P-51 Mustang, once a symbol of triumph, became a relic of devastation. Its pilots, too, carried the memory of what they had done. Cities burned, skies cleared, lives ended. Technology had won the war, but it had also proved something darker. That progress without wisdom is just another form of destruction. Years later, when the dust had settled and the world began to rebuild, one former Japanese intelligence officer, now an old man, spoke to a historian. His words were simple, almost broken. We did not lose to America's machines. We lost to our own lies. That confession, more than any weapon, defined the war's legacy. Today, when people look back at the P-51 Mustang, they see elegance. The gleaming silver body, the grace of its flight, the sound of its engine. Few see the invisible story that followed it, the mistakes, the arrogance, the fear of truth. Yet it is that story that matters most. Because history is not only a record of what happened. It is a mirror for what still happens. In every age, in every nation, someone is tempted to shape facts to fit belief, to comfort power with illusions. And every time the outcome is the same. Reality arrives, silent and patient, waiting for arrogance to fall asleep. And then, like the Mustang over Tokyo, it strikes. So as you listen to this story, remember, wars are not lost only in combat. They are lost in the quiet rooms where truth is ignored. They are lost in the meetings where someone says what their superior wants to hear. They are lost when pride becomes policy. If this story has made you think, then let it stay with you. Let it remind you that the most dangerous enemy is not out there, it's within. It's the voice that says, we already know. The useless Japanese spies did not set out to destroy their empire. They believed they were serving it. They believed they were protecting it. But belief without truth is blindness. And blindness in time becomes destiny. History gives us warnings, but it never forces us to listen. It whispers again and again in the ruins of every fallen power. Question what you think you know. Doubt your certainty. Seek truth even when it hurts. Because somewhere out there, another Mustang is already taking shape. Another truth waiting to be ignored until it's too late. If you value stories like this, stories that cut beneath the surface of history, subscribe. Not for entertainment, but for remembrance. Every lesson we forget waits for its next chance to repeat. The sky above Japan is quiet now. The smoke has cleared. But if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The distant echo of an engine that once changed the world. And in that echo lives the final truth of this story. Victory belongs not to those who believe the loudest, but to those who see the clearest.